Hello, I'm Scott, and I'm going to show you my process for animating this angry young lady with a guitar. We're going to be working entirely in After Effects, and just to give you a heads up, I'm going to go ahead and just assume you already know the basics. So if you're just starting out, this might be a little bit difficult to follow along with. Okay, so this is our finished product, but I started off with just two finished illustrations, the starting pose and the pose I wanted to end in. I worked with a really limited palette, only a few different colors, because it can be really helpful to keep the design feeling cohesive. The other thing I wanted to think about was to have a manageable amount of layers. I didn't want a crazy amount of details going all over this. I knew I'd have to recreate this all in After Effects, and the more shapes I created, the more time consuming it would become. Another bit of my process I wanted to share is that for me and most people, your first drawing usually sucks. Your second one too. So it's okay to give it a few tries before you get it somewhere you're happy with. This was originally my first design. Well, actually that was probably about 3 or 4 drawings in. And it's still cool, a little more realistic, a little more grounded, but I thought since I was just making a short little 3-second animation, I might as well push the style. And well, yeah, it's better now. This is just better. Anyways, back to After Effects. The first thing we've got to do is trace all the shapes. It is that first really boring step for every animation. If you're not used to using the pen tool, you will be soon, because this is going to take a little while. Sometimes I keep the layer turned off, but you can still draw on it as long as it's still selected. You can also just mess with the opacity settings, whatever works. Okay, right here you can see I started drawing the hair one way, but then I delete it and I go back and I separate all those little hair strands into different bits. I thought that would be a lot easier to animate later. I could stagger the keys so they're all moving at different speeds when I'm just animating the paths. There will be a lot of little parts like that where I'm realizing, this will be a little easier to animate later on. And that sort of thing, it's really only something you figure out after doing this a few times. Eventually you'll just sort of know how you want to build it. This part can be a bit boring, but it's really important to create the best shapes you can. You also want to keep in mind that it'll be easier to animate the paths later if you use as few vertices as possible. That also just keeps it looking nice and clean. When you have fewer points, it's just smoother curves that go along the paths. Although I'm not sure that these little facial bits are the best example, but we'll get to how they work later. Oh hey, so this is where I put the shadow underneath the hair that goes on the face. And instead of using a matte, I'm using an effect called the set matte, which you can see in the top left corner. And I'm just setting the matte to this face layer, so I don't have to worry about it too much anymore. So here you can see I'm working on the eyes, and there's a lot of different shapes, and I tweaked them for a long time. I kept all of it together in one grouping here, and once I was done with them all and I felt moderately happy, I grabbed the whole thing and I duplicated it over to reuse for the other eye. I just have to rearrange everything so it looks like a proper eye in the right position, so I'm just going back and referencing the original drawing, seeing if it looks quite right, seeing if I can improve it, and eventually it does get a little bit better. One thing you'll notice is that I'm often putting a bunch of different shapes in the same layer. This is important because when they're in the same layer and you're animating the paths, you can select and move them all around at the same time. If they were in different layers, you'd have to deselect the layer you're currently on, select the new one, then select the paths, and then move it separately. It's way more of a pain and it feels less intuitive. So here we're building the jacket for the character, and it's made up of 2 parts. It's the foreground part of the jacket and the background part of the jacket, and as we're animating, we just have to make sure they line up next to each other. Continuing on, we're just going to get all those details in there, all these little lines that, show the folds of the jacket. We're going to make sure they have round end caps. This lower arm, we're putting it all together in one little shape. Definitely we're keeping it kind of like a normal rig with an upper arm, a lower arm, and a hand. They'll all be parented together. We'll get into that stuff later though. Although for this arm, because it goes behind the back part of the jacket and then in front of the guitar where the wrist is, we need to have an extra layer that kind of pops up on top. And then it'll just follow along. It's kind of a patch. Going through the guitar, the original style didn't have that brighter yellow for this pose, but for the other pose it did have a brighter yellow for the underside of the guitar, so I changed it a little bit. Guitar strings also, there's only 4 strings, so I guess it's probably a bass guitar. And each of those strings ties up into one of the little circle bits. You can tell I really know how guitars work. It's a loose guitar, it works. Each finger here is just a single shape. You can separate it out into joints, but I'm not doing anything really detailed with the hands, so I'm not going to bother in this case. Lots of tweaking throughout this whole thing. The stomach is made up of 2 layers, the skin and then the shadow on top of it. The hands only have 2 real joints, which makes it a little easier to deal with, but we can always add in more definition later. Alright, this shape is going to be our hips. It's our center of mass for the entire body. This is where all the motion comes from. Everything starts with the hips and moves on out. And then we have all these fun little lines, and since we're still doing an upper leg and a lower leg, it's actually kind of difficult because that tracksuit line needs to continue into the lower leg every time. We pretty much just have to babysit it as we're moving the legs around and make sure they keep lining up. I'm not even, since the toe little cutouts for the laces are the same color as the background, I'm just letting it extend into space. It doesn't really matter. Once again, I duplicated my right leg to get copied over to the left. At least it'll stay the same length that way, even if I'm going to change up where all the folds are. It probably didn't save me much time, but it saved me a little bit of time. Almost to the end now. Almost there. Get the shadow. We leave those little cuts out in the shadow that were from the drawing because I thought it looked nice. And then, of course, we need this scribble on the top of the head. And just like that, we're all finished laying out our shape layers. All done. It looks just like the original illustration now, right? So the next step is to set the pivot points for every shape so it rotates from the proper spot. And while we're doing that, we're going to parent everything to what it needs to be parented to. So the hair gets parented to the head, and the head to the neck to the collar, and the collar to the shirt, to the stomach, to the hips. You get the idea. Then the hips will connect to a knoll that controls the entire thing, and that's basically our camera control. And at first, I'm just connecting the feet to the lower leg, and then the upper leg to the hips, but later I'm going to decide to just leave the feet parented directly to the main knoll. I'm never really lifting the feet off the ground, so it doesn't really help me to connect them up. So as you can tell, we're not really building a rig so much as we're building a collection of shapes to help us keep everything organized. But you're probably asking, why not build a full rig? Well, rigs are very good at specific things. Wait, let me qualify this statement. There are 2 kinds of rigs. There are these amazingly complex rigs that let you do nearly anything, and they're built by a team of people over a period of months, and they're what you'll see on big animated TV series. But I don't have the interest or, frankly, the ability to spend that long on a rig for my 3-second animation, so we're going to set that aside. The other kind of rig is a nice simple Duik or other similar setup that creates IK and FK handles for your arms and legs. And what they do is very cool, but only if you stick to doing only what the rig is capable of. And that means keeping everything very flat and 2-dimensional. If you want to distort for perspective like we're going to do, or even just move your hand directly towards the camera in 3D space, you're out of luck. So in the end, you'll have created this rig that is constraining your imagination, and you'll begin to settle for what the rig can do rather than what you first imagined. And the second you begin to settle in your animation, well, it's going to show it in your work. And realistically, building a rig probably isn't going to save you much time. In any case, there's no right way to do it, but certainly this is the way I prefer. Yo, alright, we've parented everything on up, and now we're ready for the next step. First, just setting the comp to be only 3 seconds long, because I'm pretty sure that's how long this is going to be. Then I'm going to select all of my shape layers, search for paths, so the paths bit opens up. Then I'm going to set a path key for everything, easy peasy. After that, I'm selecting everything again, hitting P and R to bring up position and rotation and setting keys for all of them. I'm also going to separate the X and Y position because I almost always prefer to have it that way. So now we have a buttload of keys, and if I move stuff around at another spot on the timeline, I know it'll be animated. Some of these keys might never be used, so it's a little messy, but I can delete unused ones later if I want. Right now I'm more concerned that I have to go look and make sure I've keyed something than if I have too many keys. And finally, we can start animating. That really took a while to get here, but at least we can get started. So first things first, I've decided that I want the first pose of my animation to be our young lady looking off into the distance to the left while the wind blows through her hair. You know, classic album cover shot. So we've got to start moving all of our shapes into the new position of what the profile shot of her face would look like, and this will take a minute. We're doing this with the path frames, not the position frames for the most part, by the way. And since I haven't drawn this pose out before, I kind of need to work it out and decide for myself what looks right. So there's some trial and error going on. A lot of people kind of hate doing this because it looks so janky while you're still in the process of getting everything in its proper place. If it's bothering you, sometimes it helps to turn everything off except the layer you're working on and the layers that you're finished with. I remember at this point I was struggling a lot with what her face and nose shape should be. Honestly, if I just popped open Photoshop and sketched it out, the whole thing would have gone a lot faster, but I opted not to do that for some dumb reason. So we're gonna hit the fast forward button a little harder from now on, and now we're at a point where I'm starting to feel a little bit better about her head shape. Alright, and then I just made a few last bit final tweaks to make the hair feel more dimensional, a little less flat on the side. After this, I want to have her shift her weight when she turns her head, so I'm moving the hips over to the left just a tiny bit. This is just a little adjustment. When you turn your head, your whole body kind of goes with it. It's really hard to only turn your face. So the guitar is also going to rotate around at the same time, and I just grabbed all the paths of the guitar and scaled it on the x-axis a tiny bit, because basically the front end of a guitar is pretty much a flat plane. Then you just have to adjust the edge, the bottom edge of the stem and the main guitar shape to make it look like a three-dimensional object. I'm just adjusting the keys a little bit here to work on timing, see how it'll feel, giving it an ease. Alright, and what I'm about to do right here is add an adjustment layer with an effect called Posterize Time, and that makes it animate on twos, so it animates every other frame. Basically, I only have half as many frames that I have to really focus on getting just right. So here I'm selecting all of the keys for the face turn animation, and I'm giving them all a strong ease, so it's going to turn a lot faster and ease in at the very end. After that, what I'm trying to do is give the head turn animation just a little bit of an arc to it. Usually everything a human does is an arc, so it's never really this flat turn from left to right. So I just kind of pull everything down a little bit so it looks like there's just a little tilt. Watch it like a billion times. We're also going to give the hair a little overlapping animation. The hair just takes an extra second to catch up with the rest of the head. So like that. And that's kind of what we were going for. It's a lot snappier. It eases into that final frame really hard. I'm still not entirely happy with everything, and I'll continue adjusting it, but right now what I'm doing is I just wanted to have that wind blowing her hair a little bit. I'm probably getting a little ahead of myself. This is something I probably could have left for later. I should have hit all the main poses first, but sometimes you just want to see how it's going to look once you add some of the finer details. So getting the lapel jackets, just animating the paths, just going left and right, left and right. Just giving everything some movement. It's the easiest thing in the world. I didn't even touch the eases. It's just a tiny bit of pant movement too. When everything moves, it feels really nice. Lots of hair adjustments. And now we're looking pretty good. Obviously, I haven't done the wind blowing for the after the turn. But we're moving on to the next pose. And I know after this, she's going to turn and raise her hand up with the guitar pick to hit it. And I was thinking, maybe she like slams her heels together and kind of goes on her tippy toes. I was kind of working this out as we go. I had it in my head, this idea that she was raising the guitar pick over her head, but I hadn't sketched it out, and I knew she was going to turn towards the camera a lot more, so I started just moving everything over. And I hadn't even touched the arms yet. I know it was looking janky, and then I got really frustrated and decided, alright, I'm just going to open Photoshop and make a sketch. So, skipping the Photoshop drawing part, made myself a quick little sketch. And figured I'd just work on it piece at a time. Start with the legs, match it to the sketch, scale them down. Since we're going for a perspective, the feet are going to be further away from the camera, so they get smaller. And then we just have to connect, the upper legs and lower legs, so it gets larger as we get closer to the camera. Not worried too much about the fine details yet. Just trying to make it work. The sketch made it so much easier to visualize what I was trying to do, and I was annoyed that I didn't do it earlier. Obviously, this isn't the final pose I ended up going with, but at the time I really liked this idea of the arm going way above the head to slam down on the guitar. Just testing it out, making sure everything's moving in a way. Doing one shape at a time so it's a little easier to work with. I'm sticking pretty close to the sketch right now, even though the sketch was super rough, but later I'll exercise some creativity. Just scaling it all down so it looks like it turns sideways a little bit. And you can see how I'm adjusting the back and top of the guitar. That gives it its 3D shape. It's also showing how it's useful to have all your shapes in one layer so you can move them all at once. I'm still trying to figure out the jacket shape here. I thought maybe the lapel came off over on top of the guitar strap, but I ended up not liking that. I didn't worry about the hand pose at this position, and the way the arm was rotating wasn't going to be the final animation if I kept it this way. It was going to just head straight up, but for now we're just setting up a pose and we're not worrying about the transition in between. Now we got a bunch of pieces. Obviously the motion is weird, but I'm not thinking about that too much. We're just trying to get that pose. This idea I had of her looking like straight up at the sky as she's about to throw the guitar pick down. I don't know why I liked that idea at first, but it ended up just feeling weird, right? Bunch of different hair pieces. I duplicated the ear to get a new ear in there. Okay, so right now what I'm doing is I'm copying over all the keys from when her head had just turned, and I'm gonna give it a nice hold pose, basically. So she turns her head, and then it holds for a half second, instead of just this smooth motion that goes from turning her head to raising her hand in the air. So it'd be like look, pause, then make the next pose. this point I'm getting more and more. I'm like, what is happening? Why does she look like this? But I still haven't given it up yet. I'm still just messing with eases. Still thinking about it. I'm like, how do I make this work? Okay, and this was the point. I was like, nope, no more arm in the air, no more Hitler Youth pose. I'm just gonna have her holding the guitar pickup in front of her chest a little more. Obviously there's some layer issues, but what I'm gonna do later is just duplicate the lower arm and have it at a higher layer. And it'll just switch over from one to the other when it needs to. But I'm not stressing about it yet. It's not important to me yet. In fact, just hiding the hand for now, so I don't even have to look at it. I'm also gonna make the perspective a little stronger, bringing the feet up a little closer to the main body, and this head, no more looking at the sky, looking forward. It just seems more like what the character would want to do. Just dragging all the shapes, putting them into our new position. Movement's starting to feel good. Getting that perspective a little closer. Her head was way too far back. It should be overlapping more with her shirt collar like it is now. This whole process is lots of just finding problems and fixing them. Much like sculpting, you're just slowly cutting away all the imperfections until it starts looking the way you imagined it. Which can be difficult to do. So you have to continually look at your work critically. I'm using the main body null right now to figure out the camera move. It scales in on the character a little bit as the camera moves above her. One thing to keep in mind is that when you're animating a camera move using the paths and the character layers, and the perspective and the character's body shape is changing a lot, is that you can't have overlapping keys. You have your first pose and you have all their keys set on, let's say, 1 second in, and you have your second pose's keys all set on second number 2. All the eases also need to be exactly the same. Later we'll go ahead and adjust and add overlapping motion, but unlike when you're working with a simpler setup, you can't just slide over some of the keys to the side to make a motion overlap. At first I was thinking maybe her eyes look somewhat closed from this top angle, but later I decided maybe we'll just pop them open a little bit so you can still see the whites of it. And you just kind of gotta tweak the points so it curves around with the face. Once again, copy and pasting the frames from one eye to the other. The nose can overlap the lips just a little bit. I futzed with the shape of everything on this for quite a while, I remember. Shadow is what's defining the difference between the head and the neck, since they're both the same color. Trying to give a little depth to the guitar, just tweaking the shapes. Everything needs to be tweaked, basically. And there we go, this is kind of like the first pass, and we're getting closer. So I duplicated the lower arm, and I have a version where it's above the shirt and the jacket, and I just turn it on when the hand rotates up. So I grabbed that second keyframe image that I drew, and I'm just using that same hand as reference. And it'll take a minute to get all the fingers and lines in position, but once it does, it ought to work. The stroke widths are just too wide right now, but I'll adjust that later. You can animate the stroke widths, by the way. So in preparation for moving along to our final pose, I'm just setting a keyframe for all the layers. Alright, so now we're going to start moving into this next pose. So first things first is the guitar, which took me a second. And this first time I actually screwed it up because I rotated the paths instead of using the rotation of the entire shape. And when you rotate the paths, it's just the in-betweens aren't right. So while this is going to be close to what I'm looking for eventually, I'll have to do some minor revisions to make it actually animate properly. But still, this wasn't a complete waste of time. I still did use these shapes in this position. I just had to unrotate and re-rotate. As you can see, the strings are all coming off. That was part of the problem because I rotated with the paths. Also, it just didn't look right for a little while. It just took me a while to find the shape I needed. The illustration itself didn't show the entire thing. The arms were covering it up. I, cheated it a little bit. So I'm bringing the entire torso down because I'm imagining her kind of like leaning over as she bends into it. Now, because the very first pose that I started with actually had a 3/4 view for the face, I just copied all those path frames over and started working off of that because that was so much closer than moving everything over from the view in the last pose. Once again, this is so much easier once I know what I want the final pose to look like. Honestly, I should spend way more time in Photoshop than I do in After Effects. Planning makes everything easier. So looking pretty close to the original, but still some room to get it closer. Going back and forth between the frame you're trying to hit and what you've actually made is important. So I'm not using the old hand for this, I'm redrawing an entire new hand because why not? We're just gonna kind of pop between this hand and the other one. Old hand pops to new hand. Still messing with the eases for everything. I select all of the frames. Now currently this is just pose to pose, so it's not, all the way there yet. It's really boring. It's not really a actual animation yet. But we're not worried about the transition, just doing the pose to pose, just getting the pose where we want it, as I've said about 100 times in this. The color of the hair, also we're animating it change on a certain frame. For that back hair that's a lighter blue than the rest of the hair. Taking my time tweaking this eye. The eyes are what everyone looks at, so you might as well take your time and make it look as close as you can. Duplicated that bottom lip to add it as a shadow, and then I turned it on when necessary. Adding more shadows. So at this point, I'm just trying to get the follow-through of the hand strumming the guitar. Figuring out exactly the path it's going to take and the pose we end at. I also need to make sure that the hand comes up a little higher as we move into the next pose. We don't want the hand to go first. The hand is a later motion than the camera shift. So I'm just kind of raising it up even after the camera starts tilting in. Also making some small leg adjustments. We want the leg on the right side of the screen to be grounded. There's no lines on the ground that give us a reference, and the camera is moving to the right, so it looks like the feet are just coming together, but in fact, it's the right leg stays grounded and the left leg comes to snap into it. You can see that the way the hand holds a little bit in the air before it strums the guitar. It's much better than it was before. Now I'm just adjusting the motion of the main body null, and here I added a second null that just adds this little bit of extra scale at the end, right there. So the motion continues really slightly. Sometimes it's easy to just create another null and link the old null to the new null, just so you can have a separate set of keys to work with that haven't been already moved around. In this case, that new null was in the center of the screen, so it made the scale just perfectly centered. Work on this hand pose. It's gonna have to animate a little better than it was before. I'll be adjusting that a lot more in the future too. Just as I'm trying to figure out what's the in-betweens. How is this hand flipping all the way around as quickly as possible and as naturally as possible? So I'm moving back to some of these in-between poses, and the hair is gonna, need to catch up with the face as we're pushing through really fast. So we're gonna have this nice secondary motion where the hair is gonna fly up after she strums the guitar. It'll make it feel a lot more powerful. Gonna mess with the eases a lot too, just experimenting until it feels good. So there we go, that's what we've gotten to at first. And that's not all the way there yet, obviously, but it's progress. A little bit better. The hair still feels really stiff though, right? Like there's a wire in it. We want this the jacket to kind of go with it too. And so at the very last frame, I'm letting her eyes continue to kind of open up and her face to turn just a little bit so the motion continues. We don't want her to come to a complete stop as soon as she touches the guitar. So now you still get a little more life in her eyes. See this slight opening, slight turn. The hand is kind of moving down slow while it strums the guitar too, so we'll probably adjust that later. We also wanted to adjust how the timing for when the guitar gets pulled up. We want to make sure it's that right hand that's actually pulling the guitar neck up. We didn't want it to just happen randomly. You get a lot more motion on the lapels. Some weird poses I'm trying to fix, the in-betweens that just weren't quite right. You can't rely on the path animation to do all the work for you. You gotta adjust things where it looks a little bit off. Just gonna let the eyebrow raise up a little at the end too. So we're messing with this little scribble at the top. It was just, you know, for fun. Just make some random shapes. It's kind of like a halo. But that was a little too smooth, right? It was bouncing around. So I selected them all and I made them hold keyframes, which means it'll just animate every 4 frames. It's a little more, I don't know, it gives it a flavor. It's a different frame rate than the character, so it's interesting. I went back to the hand now, trying to figure out what a good in-between pose will be, because I only need 1 frame here before it switches over to the new hand. But the one that I had before wasn't working. And also this hand wasn't quite working either, so I'm just gonna keep playing with it until I feel a little bit better. This way the fingers feel like they're coming more towards the camera. We don't want to rotate the hand too much because it feels like it's flopping around. We want the smoothest way from one pose to the next. Hands are difficult, so this takes a little while. There, yeah, that's feeling a little bit better. Alright, we're gonna get these guitar strings animated, so we'll just have them strum on down right as the hand goes by, and then a little back and forth. Like that. That feels good. Then I duplicated the guitar strings, I made them white, and then I'm putting a mask on top of them so that only parts of it are white. So it kind of feels like a little shiny bit, right? And then I'm going to use this mask and kind of move it a little bit so it looks like the shine is traveling down the guitar just a little bit. And there's always improvements I can make with the hair. Especially for these in-between poses. We just want to give it some life as she's like flying around and shifting from pose to pose. Nothing's worse than static hair. Right now what we're doing is we're adding a little motion to the jacket too. We're still kind of adding in for the wind that we began in the very beginning for the first 1 second of the animation. We still want that wind to keep on going, blowing the jacket and blowing the hair. So every 8 or 12 frames we're just gonna move stuff left or then move it right. Plus we're gonna have it as secondary motion for all the other moves. Clean out the legs, they got a little messy, so we need to attach those lines. This is what I meant by babysitting the legs. But there's only so many keys, so it's not too hard. Just push things where you need them to go. Alright, doing this little sound line. So it's a simple shape, and we're just gonna do some shape animation with the path on it. First off, we're gonna just pull everything over here for the just 1 frame. Then the second frame pushes out, and then we're gonna just move it forward like this and let it kind of blurp into this new pose. Alright, this is another thing we're gonna do. One of our final steps is an effect that we have going on an adjustment layer that you can see in the top left called Turbulent Displace. And when we turn it on, it kind of roughens all the edges, as you can see. But the thing is, when it's further away, it looks like the edges are rougher than when the character is really close to the screen. So we're gonna animate the turbulent displace so that it has less power when the character is further away and more power when it's closer to the camera. And it's just a subtle thing, but it makes it look a little less vectory. And I think that's about it. I think this is a finished animation. Thank you so much for hanging out all the way to the end. I hope this was at least a little bit helpful to see how my process works. I know it was a little bit difficult with how fast it was moving, but we had to get through this in at least a reasonable amount of time. In any case, leave a comment if you have any questions. I'll try and get back and answer them. Thanks.